Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be doing something pretty different. We're going to be looking at the miniatures game Star Wars Shatterpoint, produced by Atomic Mass Games. Now, if you're one of the regular War Thunder viewers and you're not particularly interested in miniatures games, don't worry, I have my regular War Thunder content coming out as planned. I just want to take this little venture into one of my other hobbies. Now, Star Wars Shatterpoint is the new game coming out by Atomic Mass Games. It's played on a 3-foot by 3-foot mat. It uses unpainted plastic miniatures. You have to assemble and paint them. And overall, it's an objective-based skirmish game. So essentially what we're going to be doing today is we're going to divide this video into two separate parts. The first part will be focusing on like the hobby aspect, so how good are the models, how good is the assembly and the painting, detailing, all that good stuff. And I'm also going to give you some tips of advice into how I was able to paint a store copy in only about 2 days. So if you're interested in painting, you're a novice painter, or you're just interested in the quality of the models, stay around for Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is going to go more into the gameplay of Shatterpoint, general game flow, rules, what makes it different from other games, what games it kind of has features in common with, all that good stuff. And speaking of painting a store copy, let's go over how I managed to get my hands on the version of the game so early to both check out the models and the rules. Level Up Games and Comics, with locations in Duluth, Athens, and Johns Creek, Georgia. They were able to supply me with one of their store copies. I assembled it and painted it for them, so they will be running demos of that copy. And if you want to check those models out in person, you can feel free to go to one of their locations. That copy in particular will be in Duluth. Level Up Games has a pretty great selection of card games and board games and miniatures games, and also has a pretty good table space for playing card games and board games, so check it out if you're in the area. And of course, they also will be carrying Star Wars Shatterpoint, so make sure to put in a pre-order if you haven't already. And make sure to tell them Rabbit sent you, not because there's any particular discount, but mostly just because I want to confuse their staff. So starting with the hobby aspect, we'll go with the elephant in the room, and that is to say Shatterpoint does come in a really big box. Now here we're going to show a comparison picture. These are the sprues that have the miniatures on them, and these are the sprues that have all the terrain on them. So obviously you can see like a lot of that internal space is devoted to the terrain. And this is one of those features that I think Atomic Mass Games really knocked it out of the park with, both with Shatterpoint and their previous game, Crisis Protocol. I think it's really easy to underestimate the amount of value it has to make sure that your players have enough terrain to make your games look suitably thematic. It basically allows all of the games being played to function as a sort of ad for your game, and it also alleviates a lot of the burden on gaming stores because they don't have to stock your specific type of terrain, and you also don't end up playing the game on a bunch of repurposed 40k or fantasy terrain. So I think that was a great decision on Atomic Mass Games' part. It's also, we'll look at the number of terrain, like the amount of table space it takes up later, is a pretty considerable amount, so with 2 players you can definitely fill out a table. And this brings us into one of our first, like, not so great aspects of the game. And, like, this is a relatively small critique. And just because I'm critiquing parts of the game doesn't mean I don't like the game as a whole. Like, I actually think the game itself is quite good. But the Shatterpoint box, at least the one I got, and I'm pretty sure all of the release ones, didn't come with physical instructions. They actually have the instructions for assembly on the website. I will show it on the screen so you can check it out. And you go here, you find the directions for the assembly of all the models, terrain, and the miniatures. And I'm not a huge fan of this because the miniatures game is very much about the tactile, the physical thing in front of you, and having that experience where you open the box and you have all the sprues laid out, and you have a big sheet of directions laid out on the kitchen table, and you're just putting together. It's just such a visceral experience that you're just not really getting when you open it up and you realize you have to have like a tablet or your computer or your phone open. So for at least the starter box, I would like to see a physical set of instructions. However, due to the way the planning is done on miniatures games, I can understand that might not be viable because obviously the instructions can only be, like, you can only put them together after you've already cemented, like, the sprue layouts, the parts, all that crap. So it's one of those things that can't really be done concurrently in the same way developing the rules and the models can be. So, like, there might have been, like, other production concerns in the way. But I still think, like, you, as a designer, it makes a lot of sense when you're doing a miniatures game that emphasizes the physical aspect, and that's the big draw. You kind of want to try and get physical instructions, at least in the starter box, where possible. Now, as far as the assembly of the terrain on the whole, I found it was quite good, although 1 or 2 of the buildings had these weird, like, you have to hold 3 walls together, and it's one of these, like, 3-handed assembly processes where, like, you're probably going to glue your thumbs together or something by the end of it, and it can be a little awkward to hold together properly. But it's kind of par for the course. There's not a lot of great ways to do that, and overall, like, the actual connection points are pretty solid. So it wasn't too bad, it was just a minor irritation. One thing I will say is the ladders and like some of the baubles that are supposed to be hanging off of the buildings didn't have any like specific connection points you were supposed to go for. So at times it felt like a little odd as to where the game was actually or where the instructions were actually expecting me to attach them. They seem to kind of rely on just having big flat surface areas, which works to an extent, but I did end up gluing at least one building to the table before before I got done with it. So like I would have liked to see like maybe some tabs or something to help indicate like exactly how those are supposed to attach. But overall, I think the terrain assembly was actually pretty good. And I like a lot of the little extras, like the boxes or like the little destroyed astromech with a little creature sitting on top of it. So those are all pretty nice. Now, as far as painting the terrain, here's one of the in-process pictures. This kind of shows you like how I cranked it out so fast. I mostly just assembled the terrain and then hit them with a primer coat of a dark gray and also a primer coat of a sand. Then just did some cleaning up on the edges, dry brushed some metal on the dark gray parts, did some like highlighting and stuff on the sand parts, along with picking out a lot of the details. Overall, like once I was done priming it and I got it on the painting table, it only took me about an hour and a half to finish all the terrain features. So you can bang them out pretty quick, assuming you like basically prime them whatever's going to be the primary color. I think that's one of the biggest like stumbling blocks for newer players. You can do a lot of heavy lifting just by priming it in the base color, because like trying to paint large flat surface areas like by hand is just awful. It will never be fast, it will never be efficient, and most importantly, it will never be particularly fun for you. As far as how it looks visually assembled, I really like the terrain. I think it looks great. There's actually a lot of it. There's actually more than I was able to truly utilize. When I get my own personal copy, I might change things around a bit, but overall, yeah, I think you get a pretty compelling amount of terrain. It looks good, looks thematic, looks appropriate for the Star Wars universe. I don't really have any major complaints about the terrain in this pack. I think it all comes together really well. Going into the scenic bases, I love that Atomic Mass Games includes scenic bases, both of this and Marvel Crisis Protocol. I am an incredibly lazy painter. I will take any shortcut I can, and scenic bases are probably the best way to do it. The big thing about scenic bases, like these in particular, if you want to know like how I bang them out, prime the entire thing in dark gray. Then I did use some painting tape to go over the dark gray areas on the base that had a mix of like the gray and the sand, and then prime them sand. Pulled off the painting tape, and then once I got them on the table, light gray over the dark gray, leaving the dark gray in the recesses. Did some bone as like edge highlighting over the entire thing. Washed the whole thing in brown, cleaned up the top of the brown like wash areas. Then just took some black paint, went around the edges, and did some minor detailing, and they were done. Total time after they were primed, like on the table with my brush, about 30 minutes. So you can knock out all the bases in the set, absolutely no problem. It does technically include more bases than you need, because it has 12 or 16 of the small bases and 2 of the large ones, which is a total of like 18 bases, and you only need 16 total. This is because the B1 battle droids are actually on the larger bases, but hey, you just have 2 spare bases, which is probably something that anybody who's played Marvel Crisis Protocol will be used to at this point. If you're wondering about the soft orange glow effect coming out of the vents on some of the bases, and I think I used this on something else at some point, it's just dark red, and then you do a thinner stripe of orange, and then you do an even thinner stripe of yellow. That's it. Like, it's a pretty straightforward painting effect. Really, anybody with a steady hand and a decent brush can do it. Getting on to the main event, the models themselves. Now, I was coming from the Marvel Crisis Protocol box set, which is like one of the first products that AMG released. I've done some of their newer stuff with Crisis Protocol, but not like the newest. So I wasn't really sure what to expect with this, because the first Crisis Protocol box was pretty rough. This box is absolutely great. So they do a lot of really cool things. First off, each individual miniature is kind of in its own section of the sprue. So like the parts for Anakin are all in one part of the sprue, and they all like have the same prefix letter. So like all parts for Anakin start with like an A. So it's really easy to find the parts for the character you're assembling. Additionally, they have a lot of strong geometric connections that kind of guarantee that you can't really put things together wrong. I mean, in some cases you can, but you can't go that far wrong with most of them. So in general, I would say they have stepped up their game with these like pretty significantly. That doesn't mean there's no issues though. The little smoke cloud for Bo-Katan, it's just like 2 smoke clouds that you have to attach together. There's not really a clear connection point that doesn't look smoke cloud-like. So it was actually kind of difficult to align. It took me like longer than it probably should have. The lightsabers also make me kind of nervous. They're like really thin. That being said, I did definitely drop one or two of them totally intentionally to test their durability, and definitely not because I'm clumsy. and they did actually survive. So like that might just be me being paranoid, but like from my experience with a lot of other games, hard plastic pieces that are that thin tend to make me a little nervous. However, the real problem with these kind of came when you get to the very last model, and I suspect it's the last model for a reason: the battle droids. Oh man, like, if you've done the battle droids in Star Wars Legion, you're probably used to them being bad, but these were actually kind of worse than Legion. And I think part of the problem is Legion uses heroic scale, that is to say, they kind of exaggerate features like the heads and the hands and the weapons, whereas these are more true scale, so like the actual proportions are like closer to real life. And the problem is battle droids are very thin and very lanky, so it leaves you incredibly weak connection points. So I wasn't really confident that I was getting the legs on right. One of the arms, the arm that's holding the front of the blaster, is actually two pieces. So I was never really confident that I was assembling that correctly either. Somehow, like, the back of the head on these is like more fiddly than the Legion ones too, and I'm not really sure how they managed that. Yeah, overall, like, I'm confident somebody at Atomic Mass Games was just scrolling through this instruction manual and was just, as soon as they came to the battle droids, like, we are definitely putting those last. We do not want somebody trying to assemble those right off the bat. But yeah, they were quite annoying, and even more so by the fact that there are 6 of them in this set. But it's not the worst thing in the world, but it definitely was not a great way to finish off these models. Now, one thing I will say is they do include quite a few like optional like heads and arms. For example, Bo-Katan and Rex, they both have like optional helmeted or non-helmeted heads. Kalani has, he has like arms holding a blaster, and then he also has arms holding like a little holographic display, which is kind of cool. And like, honestly, holographic display is definitely a way to go. But the iconic character, everybody's favorite Star Wars character that gets the most customization options by far, is obviously the famous Gar Saxon. Gar Saxon gets alternate head and arm assemblies. Like, he gets a blaster and a shield assembly, or a sniper rifle assembly, and a helmeted or unhelmeted head. Like, it's not a bad thing, but it's just such a weird, arbitrary character to have, like, the most customization options. But overall, I do like the dynamicism of the poses, and I do like the additional optional, like, assemblies, because it gives you, like, some level of customization, but also keeps them having, like, good, iconic poses, which I think is, like, a really delicate balance in terms of miniatures. But now we get into, like, kind of one of the important questions is, how easy are they to paint? As far as, like, one of the big things I look for is the definition, i.e. like how much the recesses and the relief areas like contrast with one another, because the more definition it has, the easier it is to paint, and the easier it is to use simple painting techniques to achieve a good effect. Now, by and large, the definition on these models is pretty good. The only issue I had was when you start getting into like the fabric areas, like the jumpsuits on the Mandalorians, or some of the cloth on the armor legs on some of the Jedi. Then you start to get some pretty poor definition, but like the flowing robes, the armor all have pretty good definition. And this is where we get to like one of the really cool details that I love about these sets. If you look at, say, Bo-Katan's helmet or Rex's helmet, those are not freehand details that I painted on. Those are actually recesses that are built into the helmets. So all I did with Rex was I took some blue contrast paint and just kind of drug it along these recesses to make that design. So this is a very simple thing that like anybody can do, and I absolutely love this. And you also see this relief areas, like slightly raised areas on some characters that also help you like match the kind of, I don't know, personality designs that the individual characters have. Like Darth Maul's markings are actually raised. Gar Saxon's armor markings are actually raised. So there's a bunch of stuff like that. Ahsoka Tano, like you don't have to guess where her head tails are. There's actually like lines pretty thin marking them out. So you can actually use those as like guides to paint, which is great. And this allows even a relatively novice painter to kind of sort of have some idea what they're doing. Like obviously they're not going to be producing like competition quality minis, but they can at least match the paint scheme they want without having to try to resort to like some very dodgy freehanding. So overall, like I absolutely love that detail. It's fantastic that they included it. In general, I found the models as a whole were pretty easy and pretty fun to paint. Their level of detail is just right. The definition a little weak in some areas, but broadly speaking, like the definition is good enough that you can use some fairly quick painting techniques and still bang out the majority of the model, whereas you might have to like use some slightly different techniques to go for like some of the other areas. But overall, the model's assembled well, they painted well. I love the poses, I love the way it looks on the table. Broadly speaking, you know, probably about a 9 out of 10. Like, could be a little better, but overall, I think the models in the set are great, and they represent a huge step forward, especially over like AMG's original effort in the Marvel Crisis Protocol box. So, yeah, I think they did a great job on these. And that's going to wrap us up for Chapter 1. Stay tuned to the channel before we go into Chapter 2, where we talk about the gameplay. Of course, the easiest way to find out when that drops is to just subscribe to the channel. But, you know, I'm not your mom. You do what you want.